Happy Easter. He is risen. Normally that's the spot where you respond, he is risen indeed. So let's try that again. He is risen. I'm guessing that it would be a little more interactive if we were actually able to be in the same building together. This is unlike any Easter I have ever experienced. It's certainly unlike any Easter I have ever preached before. Instead of standing here in an auditorium with a crowd, I am preaching to an empty room. This Easter is unlike any Easter I've ever celebrated. We are celebrating Easter in the midst of a global pandemic. We've been told to stay at home, to socially distance, to not gather together to celebrate. There's no Easter brunch, there's no Easter egg hunt, there's no Marie Bristol's bunnies lined up for the kids that she has rehabbed and given away again. It is unlike any Easter I have ever celebrated, except for the most important thing about Easter. Here's what it says in the Gospel of Luke. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and they went to the tomb. They found the stone had been rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." All right, now, I don't know if you got that at home, but that was a great spot for another He is risen indeed. So I know we can't do it as a group, but we can do it wherever you are watching this sermon, if you're listening to it online. So anytime I say He is risen, the proper response is He is risen indeed. All right, so since there is no junior church and you're not going to dismiss the kids today as you're watching this in the living room, on the couch, or wherever it is, gathered around the computer, why don't you take a second to pause and come up with the rules of the game? Right? And here's what I mean by that. Like, there are going to be lots of opportunities in this message for you to say He is risen indeed. So why don't you make a little hunt out of it? And the first person maybe to say He is risen indeed gets a point, or the one who captures the most He is risen indeeds, or the one that says it the loudest or the most creative. Have a little bit of fun with it. So if you want to pause right now, and then you can figure out the rules of your He is risen indeed game at home. You got to unpause though. Unpause. All right. He is not here. He is risen indeed. This is a test. 8 weeks ago, when I started working on this message, I jotted down a list of ideas. And as I was going through them and thinking about them and praying about them, one word kept coming back over and over again. One word: empty. I had no idea 8 weeks ago what that would mean in our world today, what that would be like for us today. I mean, if you think about where we were 8 weeks ago compared to where we are today, it is unbelievable. I mean, right now, stores are closed. They're empty inside. There's no people. In some parts of the country, when you try to go to the grocery store, you are finding empty shelves. When you get up in the morning and you go outside, the roads are empty. Traffic has decreased like 50% in a lot of places, some even more. And sadly, on Easter Sunday, churches all across the United States and even all across the world are empty. We're told that this is bad and it's going to get worse, especially here in Minnesota. We are all going to be impacted by this. We already all have, but it might get worse. I'm guessing that some of you already know people who have been infected with coronavirus. Before this is said and done, many of you who are watching right now will likely be infected with COVID-19. I imagine that all of us, when this is over, might know someone or have lost someone important to us as a result of this. So, with that thought in mind, I mean, why an empty message? I mean, isn't this the time where we want a message that is full of hope, a message that is full of inspiration, a message that is full of comfort and joy? We want a full message. We don't want an empty message, because there is enough emptiness out there in the world right now. But here's the crazy thing about how God works. His wisdom, his logic, is not like ours. Now, I know that there are some of you right now who send your kids off to school, but now the kids are home and you are having to help them with the math, right? You know who I'm talking about. And you're sitting there with the math and you know the answer and you know how to get the answer, but they're doing some sort of crazy logic that you've never seen or heard of before, and this is called this new math. So you're looking at the equation and the equation makes no sense. You know how to figure it out and get to the answer, but it's the equation that's different. God's equation is often different than ours. So here's God's crazy equation. You want full life? Start in the empty tomb. We find wisdom and joy and peace and purpose in an empty tomb. Do you know why? Because the tomb is empty. He is risen. For those of you who got roped into this couch church and you are not a follower of Jesus, you're probably wondering, why does the empty tomb of a Jewish carpenter who turned rabbi, who lived over 2,000 years ago, matter to me at all? Who cares if the tomb is empty? All right, so I want to do this message in two parts. I want to talk first of all about fact and then about faith. Fact and faith. So we have good evidence for believing that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the death and resurrection of Jesus, is an historical event. The resurrection of Jesus is a historical event. Let me just give you a couple thoughts around this. First of all, there are reliable historical documents that show that the resurrection actually happened. We have multiple independent authors who wrote about the event: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Apostle Paul. By standards that we apply to any other ancient text, these are historical documents, not fanciful, legendary documents. And there's several reasons for this. First of all, they provide accurate historical detail that you don't find in legendary documents. Second, multiple accounts don't all agree on all of the details. And maybe that sounds like a bad thing, that we have documents that have disagreeing details. But think about if you interviewed 5 witnesses to one event, you would probably get different details. You know, how many people were in the crowd, what color was the shirt, how tall was the person, what color was their hair. All 5 of them, seeing things from different perspectives, wouldn't agree on all of the details. Third, they were written within years after the event happened. They weren't written hundreds of years later. They were written within years of when the event happened. There were still people around that could challenge that and say, no, that's not how it happened. They also provide embarrassing details. So if you're going to write a document, you're going to write yourself in as the hero. But the disciples are often portrayed as being slow to understand. They give embarrassing details, like the fact that Peter denied Jesus, the fact that Judas betrayed Jesus. The documents refer to witnesses and people who were still alive at the time the documents were written. The number of copies and fragments of copies that we have over the last 2,000 years that can be dated to within years, centuries of when the event took place, and the fact that all of those documents by and large agree, gives us confidence that the documents that were written 2,000 years ago are very much like the documents we have today. So if the documents are historical and reliable, then how do you explain the transformation of the disciples? I mean, once you accept that they're generally reliable, how do you explain the disciples? Because they go from hiding to preaching boldly. They go from cowards to courageous followers of Jesus Christ, and they do it preaching one message: Jesus Christ died and risen from the dead. Now, here's the thing. People don't generally ever die to cover up a lie that they know is a lie. 10 of the 12 disciples were executed for proclaiming the truth of Jesus Christ risen from the dead. Now, why would 10 people go to their graves if they knew what they were writing was a lie. They were tortured and executed, and not a single one of them recanted. And then if you look at what happens with the church and church growth during this time, it is an explosive growth in the early church. So the early church begins in Jerusalem just weeks after Jesus' death and resurrection. And church growth explodes as the followers preach one message: Jesus Christ and Him risen. For 300 years, the early church is persecuted, and yet it continues to grow in the face of overwhelming opposition and persecution with one message: Jesus Christ died and risen. And the last thing is this: the tomb is empty. Right? So the opposition in the weeks and the months after Jesus' death and resurrection, all they had to do to stop the Christian movement was produce a body. Everybody knew where it was buried. Like this was the talk of the town. This was the coronavirus of the day, right? You couldn't go to the market. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing about it, thinking about it, talking about it. Everybody knew where Jesus' body had been buried. All they had to do to stop the Christian movement was bring the body of Jesus out and say, "Doesn't look like He's risen to me." All right, so if you take the resurrection of Jesus as a fact, as a historical fact, the next question is, what are you going to do with that? By faith. Once you accept that the resurrection of Jesus is a historical fact, here's what happens by faith. By faith, in the empty tomb, we see the wisdom of God. Now, I've already told you, God's equation is not like our equation, right? So when you start to think about things being empty, in human terms, empty usually is not a good thing. I mean, think about all of the things you associate with empty. Like, hey, I am feeling empty today. Or someone gives you an empty promise. Or you have an empty tank of gas. Or you go to the cupboard and it's empty. You log online right now and you look at your retirement savings and find that it is trending towards empty. The milk carton is empty. You have an empty bank account because of a scam. You have an empty wallet because you are unemployed. Imagine you are a grieving friend. So your mentor, your hero, your teacher has died. And you go to their grave. And it's empty. What would you do? Right? Because human logic says, someone has taken the body, right? Like there is no other logical explanation for them not being in the grave, because people don't just come out of the grave once you put them in. The women went to the tomb and they found that the tomb was empty, and it made no sense. But God's like, you're trying to solve the equation wrong. The tomb is empty. But you've got the wrong reason, the wrong equation for why it's empty. It's empty not because someone took the body. It is empty because He is alive. Here's what Paul writes in his first letter to the church at Corinth. The message of the cross is foolishness. Foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And you got to remember, God does this all the time. So when Israel needs a king, God doesn't go pick out the strongest person. He doesn't pick someone from a royal family. God goes instead to a shepherd family. And then He picks the smallest, most insignificant, youngest person. His name was David. And he becomes King David, a man after God's own heart. When Jesus is choosing followers, He doesn't go to the elite. He doesn't go to the learned. He goes to the fisherman, to the tax collector. And the people that start to follow Him are not the religious elite. No. It's not the wealthy. It's not the people who have all of the status here. It's the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the broken and the insignificant. And if you read through Jesus' teachings over and over and over again, He takes what we think sounds logical and He turns it upside down. God takes the cross, the symbol of death and despair at that time, and turns it into the symbol of life. God says, you want to be exalted? Humble yourself. You want to be great? Then serve others. Because significance is not measured by how much authority you have over other people, but how you use your authority to lift other people up. Jesus tells us if you want to be free, then surrender your life to God. If you want to live, die to yourself and live for God. If you want a full life, start at the empty tomb. In the empty grave, we see the wisdom of God, and in the empty grave, we see the love of God. All right, you need to lock this in because your picture of God matters. Jesus is the full and complete revelation of what God looks like. If you want to know what God looks like, look to Jesus. So how does that show us God's love? Listen to these words from John. John says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Paul writes this in the book of Romans. Very rarely will someone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. All right, so now I'm going to be a little bit embarrassing and transparent. There are two movie genres that I love. Like, my two go-to movie genres. First one's cool because, guy, and I love end-of-the-world disaster movies, right? Like, the bigger the disaster, the better. This part's hard to say in front of a camera. The second genre that I am drawn to, no, sorry, guys. Because if you're sitting there with your wife, she's going to nudge you and be like, why can't you be like that? I love cheesy romantic movies. Like, I could sit and binge watch the Lifetime channel. I'm sorry. All right, so here's the thing, though. Wait, just think about this. Think about this for a minute, okay? The two storylines is pretty much the exact same story, right? Because you start and everything is good. Like, life is going along fine, and then boom! Conflict, disaster, issues, problems, and it's all a mess. And then how it gets resolved at the end in a disaster movie, in a romantic comedy, in a romantic, is someone makes a sacrifice. Someone shows love in a self-sacrificial way, and we win. And it's all is good, happily ever after in the end. If you think about it, that's the story of the gospel. That's the story of Jesus. You think everything's fine, and then Jesus lays down his life. John says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. God demonstrates self-sacrificial love. God says, I could not have gone any farther. I could not have done any more than I did for you. That's love. And if you think about it, those are the stories that we are hearing about day after day after day in the midst of this pandemic. It's that heroic self-sacrificial love. It's the medical worker who continues to show up for work day after day without proper protective gear because she cares so deeply for the people in trouble. It's the fireman and the police officer and the paramedic. But it's more than that. It's the person working at the convenience store or the grocery store that is still going to work because they know how much people need those supplies. It's the grocer who is still stocking shelves in the grocery store at the risk of getting themselves sick. It's the widow who takes the food that she has prepared to someone else at the risk of making herself sick. It's the guy who takes half of the money that he's got even though he has lost his job and he is struggling and shares it with someone else. Those are the stories that make us want to stand up and cheer with tears in our eyes because it is the story of people loving self-sacrificially. That's the story of the empty tomb. It's the story of Jesus Christ. The tomb is still empty. He is risen indeed. In the empty tomb, we see God's wisdom. We see God's love. And in the empty tomb, we can find strength. We human beings, we are a resilient bunch of people, but there will come a time when all of us feel like we don't have any more to give, where we are at the end of ourselves, where we just can't go on. And that's when God says, I am here. When we get to our weakest point, that's when God lifts us up and God shines bright. This is what the prophet Isaiah says. Isaiah says, even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. If you look at the people in the gospel story, Peter goes from denying Jesus 3 times, from running away, from cowering before a little servant girl who said, weren't you with them? To 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, standing up and boldly proclaiming Jesus Christ and him crucified in the town square in front of everyone, not caring what was going to happen to him because he had the strength of Jesus Christ. He goes from coward to courageous. The Apostle Paul was a staunch advocate of Jesus, and he preached him boldly. And this is what Paul writes. God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, in difficulty. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. Now, if you don't know the Apostle Paul's story, he is not writing this from a place of privilege. He's not living in a palace just, chopping down popcorn and peanuts. No, he had a hard life. This is the Paul who was imprisoned frequently. And our prisons today are cushy compared to what he went through. He was put in prison frequently for preaching. He was flogged repeatedly. He was beaten with rods, pelted with stones, shipwrecked. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. He spent a night and a day out in the open sea. He was in danger from others. He went without food and water. He said, I know what it is to be hungry and naked and in need. And yet he says, when I am weak, then I am strong. This is what he says in his letter to the Philippians. He said, I can do all things through him, Jesus Christ, who gives me strength. So, when you feel like you have come to the end of the line, when you feel like you have nothing left to give, when you just can't take it anymore, that's when God says, I am here. Let me lift you up. Let me carry you. Let me be your anchor and your rock. Let me give you my strength. The last thing is, in the empty tomb, we find hope. Hope is something that we need in our world right now. So let me ask you, what do you put your hope in? Think about where we were just 3 months ago. Right, 3 months ago, the world economy is going strong. It's never been better. Longest bull market in U.S. history in the stock market. And then it crashed. We went from record unemployment to the most number of unemployment claims in U.S. history in the last several weeks. If you were like me, you went from dreams of spring and summer and gardening and getting outside and maybe dreams of graduation and prom and a new job, and to nightmares about ventilators and viruses. So what are you putting your hope in? If you're putting it in your finances, I'm assuming your retirement account looks a lot like mine. It's trending towards empty. Are you putting your hope in your job because so many people have been furloughed or let go from their jobs? Are you putting your hope in your family and they've been socially quarantined and distant? Are you putting your hope in your health? Because that seems a little uncertain right now. What are you putting your hope in? Over the last 12 weeks, we have found out how fragile the things that we typically put our hope in this world really are. It took less than 3 months to go from the strongest economy to essentially the world being shut down and scared. See, if you take the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a historical fact, then by faith, you have a hope that cannot be shaken, a hope that can never be taken. This is what Paul says. He says, if Christ has not been raised, in other words, if it's not a fact that Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead, then your faith is useless and you are still guilty of your sins. In that case, all who die believing in Jesus are lost. If our hope for Jesus is only in this life, then we are to be pitied more than anyone else in the world. In other words, if the resurrection is not a fact, then your faith is useless and you might as well not even do this. But, Paul says, in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. You see, we have a hope that is greater than life itself because it is anchored in Jesus Christ and Him crucified. It is anchored in a God who defeated our greatest enemy, sin and death. He erased the debt of our sin that separates us from a loving Creator, and He turned the destination called the grave from a destination to a doorway. Peter, Jesus' follower who denied Him 3 times, who cowered and then became courageous, writes this: Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In His great mercy, He has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance, heaven, that can never perish, spoil, or fade. As I was working with Pastor Wayne on this message, I think he said it best. While the rest of the world is stocking up on toilet paper, we can stock up on hope. The hope and joy that Jesus' followers experienced 2,000 years ago is still there today. You see, on Friday, Jesus' followers were devastated. They were distraught. They were despairing. They were desperate. On Saturday, they were hiding. On Sunday, filled with sorrow, they walked to the empty tomb. They went to the tomb expecting to find a body. Instead, they found it empty. They went thinking they were going to find death. Instead, they found life. They went thinking they would find despair. Instead, they found hope. And that hope is available to you today. The moment that Jesus' followers found the empty tomb, it changed their lives forever. It changed the world forever. Those 7 words are a defining moment. He is not here. He is risen. He is not here. He has risen. That's the moment that God declared, I am not willing that anyone should perish, but all should come to repentance. That's the moment that Jesus declared, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Anyone who comes to me comes to the Father. That is the moment that God said, do not despair because death has been defeated. That is the moment that God declared that the grave is not a destination, it is a doorway. That is the moment that God said there is nothing in all creation, not even death itself, that can separate you from my love. That is the moment that God declared no matter how dark it gets, you have hope because the tomb is empty. He is not here. He has risen. Friends, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what life is going to look like in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. I don't know how this pandemic changes the world. But I do know that the fact of the empty tomb by faith can change the world. See, there is much in this world right now to fear. I don't know what your greatest fear is, but it's very likely that at some point, for some of you watching, your greatest fear will come true in the next several months. Unless, of course, your greatest fear is speaking in public to a group of more than 10 people, then you're probably safe. But if your fear is losing your job, losing someone you love, it's possible, maybe even likely, that for some of us, those greatest fears are going to come true. So what are you going to put your faith in that moment? As we face the challenging days ahead, days that could be filled with worry and pain and fear, we can either trust in the things of this world, put our faith in them, or we can put our faith in the one who has already defeated our greatest enemy. See, the tomb declares he is not here. He has risen. And when it is darkest, that's when God shines brightest. Death is defeated. The grave is not a destination, it is a doorway. And there is hope, because nothing can separate us from the love of Jesus, from the love of God that is found in Jesus Christ. So, will you allow the fact of the resurrection to change how you live? Will you live by faith rather than by fear? Because no matter what happens, no matter how bad that section in the middle of the movie gets, you know the formula. There's a happily ever after at the end. And that section in the middle, it could get bad, it could get ugly, it could get awful. But there is hope. Because in the end, death is defeated. This Easter is unlike any other Easter we have ever celebrated, except for one thing. The tomb is empty. He is risen!
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He has
risen
indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.
He
Is
risen indeed.
He is risen indeed.